Hello. Arrival came out in 2016. It's almost 2020. Why the fuck am I doing this? Is it because burying Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man with a time travel movie has reminded me how much I fucking hate time travel? Or is it because the time travel in Arrival is supposed to be supported by actual science? Which fact has caused me to begin to wonder whether science has lost its fucking mind. I don't know. Anyway, here is a line for the purpose of creating our timeline, because we're going to keep things linear here at the outset. Right, so we're going to start with Amy at point A on the timeline, and Amy Adams' character does have a name, Louise, but I'm going to call her Amy. At the ending of the film Arrival, Amy doesn't know what to do about this Chinese general who's about to open fire on the aliens with whom Amy's been working so hard at communicating. Aliens whom she is certain have something very important to tell us. And perhaps because she's so stressed out about this, when she moves to point A+1 on the timeline, she appears to have some kind of episode in which she has a vision of herself at some future point on the timeline. Let's call it point C. She is at a party at which is this very same Chinese general, the one who's about to blow shit up. And it's a party that's celebrating something they're calling the unification, but which I'm going to call the peace, because it's shorter and it'll be easier to fit into the little speech balloons I'll be drawing. So now let's go ahead and progress forward to point C+1 on the timeline, where Amy and the general do meet, and the general begins waxing nostalgic about that amazing and wonderful moment when Amy called him on his private number and told him his wife's name, and he was so impressed by her apparent omniscience that he decided, hey, maybe she's right about these aliens after all, and called off the guns, and the rest, shall we say, at least for the moment, as long as we're still being linear about all this, is history. Or rather, it will be history from the position of A+1, which is where Amy finds herself at the conclusion of her experience, at which point she moves forward to point B on the timeline. She calls the general, gives him the name, and he calls off the guns. And these are the wonderful events about which we suppose they will go on to one day reminisce. Okay, well, what the fuck just happened here? That is to say, what do the filmmakers want us to understand has happened here? Do they want us to understand that Amy has had a vision or a dream, as it were, of what her future self does at C and then C+1? No, they don't want us to understand that. We can't understand it that way, and here's why. Because if she were just watching the movie, as it were, of what her future self does at C and then C+1, we would not hear Amy say in reply to the general when he says, "You called me on my private number. I don't know your private number." Because, look, if Amy at C, who then goes on to be the Amy at C+1, were simply the future self of Amy at A+1, she would, in fact, know that number, because she follows from Amy at point B, who obviously knows the number because, look, she made the call. Furthermore, the Amy at C+1 actually appears less than clear on the fact that once upon a time she changed the history of the world by calling the general. So, again, who is this Amy and what is going on here? Well, what the filmmakers want us to understand, and here's where the ride gets bumpy, is that the Amy at point C, the Amy at the commencement of Amy at A+1's experience, the Amy who will go on to meet the general at C+1, is none other than Amy A+1 herself. Now you may be asking at this point, what the actual bleep? I mean, am I saying that poor future Amy C at the start of Amy at A+1's experience suddenly wink out of existence to be replaced by Amy at A+1? Well, as weird and nightmarish as that would have been, I'm afraid that what is actually supposed to have happened is even more insane. And with that, we must now turn to the science behind Arrival. And while I myself do not have the credentials of the actual physicists who were consulted on this film, I nonetheless feel confident in affirming that one of the theoretical underpinnings of the narrative of Arrival is something called the block view of time. This is a view of time which maintains that all points on the timeline, so to speak, all points in time, are all equally real. They all exist, just as all points in space exist and are equally real. This then would be why time travel is theoretically possible, because if all points in time exist, then they are there, so to speak, to be accessed by Doctor Strange's portals or by time machine or whatever. So with the block view of time as our hermeneutic, we can correctly interpret what Amy is experiencing not as a dream or a vision, but rather an epiphany, a realization that Amy at C exists just as Amy at A+1 exists. Or should we say that Amy exists at C just as much as she exists at A+1. Which means that we can affirm the same of every other point, or might we say, of every other Amy on the timeline. And this is why I am begging anyone who will listen, please, please make it stop. If we accept the description of the nature of existence in Arrival, in other words, if we accept its metaphysics, and then go on to try to analyze the state of Amy's knowledge at point C, we will end up affirming two logically exclusive and contradictory statements. In other words, shit will be deeply fucked up. Let me try to explain. Amy at C+1 does not know the general's private phone number. It follows, then, that the Amy from which Amy at C+1 follows, namely Amy C, doesn't know it either. Which, of course, is due to the fact that the Amy at C is the Amy at A+1, who herself has just stepped up from moment A, and as we saw at the beginning of all this, the Amy at moment A has no idea what to do, let alone how to call off the guns. But the problem is that, as we can plainly see, Amy at point B does know the number. And so reason would suggest that the Amy who follows from Amy at B 18 months down the timeline should also know that number. She certainly knows the number in the General's universe, and yet she does not, for reasons we have already belabored ad nauseum. So, putting it all together, and speaking strictly according to the rules of the universe of Arrival, in which every moment in time exists equally, is equally present, as it were. Putting it all together, Amy at point C, or should we simply say Amy, both does and does not know the General's private phone number. By the way, this is what it looks like when an actor is told to act like she is both at a party celebrating the culmination of her life's work and standing in the middle of a field having the veil of the illusion of time lifted from her eyes.
So, am I acting oriented or disoriented? I mean, am I feeling everything is familiar and comfortable, or am I feeling completely flooded and overwhelmed?
Yes, but of course, if we were really thinking like aliens, then we would express this simultaneity as they would. with all points on the timeline equally present to one who stands at the center of the circle of time. And of course, we can use this same extremely powerful signification to express other simultaneities on the timeline, like Amy is both alive and dead, that is, she exists and does not exist. Or, to reference a simultaneity which the movie itself presents, we can affirm both that Amy's daughter has passed away and that she has not yet been born. Have you had enough? Can I stop now? In conclusion, then, I guess I'd just like to remark on how maddeningly ironic it is that a story about a dedicated and brilliant linguist who decodes the most sublime language in the universe is, in fact, a story which completely explodes language altogether. Because all language, including and especially the language of mathematics, depends squarely on the principle of non-contradiction. I mean, can it really be the case that E both equals and does not equal mc squared? I'm even tempted to wonder aloud, impertinently and perhaps even blasphemously, whether an application of mathematics which leads to a conclusion which itself undermines mathematics is even supportable. But I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a physicist. Can't even say the word. And there are probably many people who would find all of my prattle to be woefully and tragically classical. But from what I understand, there are people out there who have better credentials than me, who themselves don't really think that block time has been that helpful a contribution to the conversation about the nature of reality, and that the theory of relativity can, in fact, do without it. But I do feel credentialed enough to affirm that any metaphysical worldview which takes beginnings, middles, and ends, tosses them into an ontological blender and hits frappe, sucks for storytelling. It also sucks for language and for reason itself. So maybe we should do a service to both science and art and kick block time to the curb, and above all, SMTTMF. Stop making time travel movies forever. Thank you.